Education is, unfortunately, particularly in Western society, education has become too institutionalized and almost stagnant as a system. Education has become peripheralized and even marginalized in terms of its true relevance to the pressing needs of society. Now, why am I saying this? What I'm saying is that the institution of the delivery of education and the facilitation of education amongst the masses of a population has fallen behind the needs of that population, the needs of that society. Thus, as a mechanism of teaching and learning and enlightening the population, to equip them to be fully empowered, to equip them to be integrated truly, productively, proactive, true members of society, to address the problems and solve the problems of society. Education is a failed institution. That doesn't obviate or negate the need for education. Yet if we are to do more than simply create a society of puppets and minimally adept members of society, then we must radically transform the nature of education. One of the things that Dr. Ray Kurzweil has demonstrated is, and addressed along with many others in the electronic media and information technology communities, is the rapidity at which information and content is exploding upon the scene of human experience. So with more and more and more expansion of available information, media exposure, social media interaction, there is a far greater need to process information in ways that are radically beyond the traditional ways of processing information. Those traditional ways of processing information are the unfortunate byproduct of a stultified, rigidified, dinosauric education system. How can we use these old methods of teaching and learning and embrace such a logarithmic and exponential explosion in available information? We cannot. How can we increase our capacity or demonstrate and actualize increased capacity for processing information when we have a pervasive campaign to dumb down the population? How can we actualize enhanced intellect and intelligence of the many different dimensions of our human experience if we are toxifying the environment and toxifying the physiology and the neurology of our population? So these are things that are happening that pose the backdrop against which we must examine the current structure and operationality of education as we understand it as a system, as an institution. We must understand it much, much more. Therefore, the question rises, what is true education? What is true education? We want to understand things insofar as what is most helpful, what is most relevant. And so earlier on, a few years ago, we recorded an 11-part series, which was addressing what we call the 7 pillars of integral education. For those who happen to have access to this channel, I invite you to watch and review those segments. What is different now compared to a few years ago when those first segments were recorded? What are we dealing with? We're dealing with intensified radicalization of the human population. Radicalization of the human population means you are pushing people to have more and more extremist views of whatever type, whether they are religious extremists, political extremists, economic extremists, intellectual extremists, moral extremists, etc. As such, there is a growing sense of fragmentation of society. This harkens back to the teachings or the writings of people such as Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. We talk about the hierarchization of society, those who have intellect and those who lack intellect, those who are more entitled, those who are less entitled. We see this still in caste systems in various countries and societies around the world where people have fixed stature in society that is essentially immutable. They can't change, they can't shift from those. So this increasing radicalization leading to increasing polarization in the global family, the global community, also then means that the traditional approaches to teaching and learning cannot apply to the vast majority of the population. A priori, it cannot apply because there is not a blending, a greater blending insofar as mutual enabling is concerned amongst people. These differences are what are being promoted, and as these differences are promoted, they become the basis for increasing hostilities, increasing polarities of policies and practices. And as such, what we would understand as truth, what we would understand as higher knowledge, is itself subject to a field of prejudgment as to what is in alignment with one's polar perspective versus another's polar perspective. What this creates, therefore, is a panoply of disparateness in views that is far beyond what have been historical cultural disparities. Therefore, the need for education also must address this dynamic that is happening within the global society. As it addresses this dynamic, it must do so from an integral construct. What does it take? What is it that must be taught? And how must it be taught that can help reunify our global population without it being an imposition, without it being a coercion, without it being a hegemonic type of tyrannical system of forced educational indoctrination? Without that, how can it be truly that which infuses into the consciousness of the masses of the population on this planet and brings people to higher states of awareness and knowledge and applicability, usability of their knowledge in ways that unify for the greater global good? Globalization is an inevitability. It is ignorance, and it is polar fragmentation of mindsets that lead to the fearing and the dreading of the unification dynamic on the planet, the mistrusts. And this is what then leads to so many of the kinds of behaviors that pit one group against another group or give the mandate to one group to try to dominate amongst others. So yes, the shadow aspect of globalization, the nefarious potentiality of globalization comes through as a result of this also increased polarization dynamic. When we approach education from unification, when we approach it from the construct of integrality, then we need not bash any culture. We need not, in fact, even bash true systems of learning. Instead, what we're able to do is optimize and synergize that vast variegated landscape of systems of processing information to achieve a greater unified process. Thus, global citizenship, for example, as one of the earlier pillars of integral education, comes forth in the construct of a true learning together amongst all of us, and not simply the global citizenship of knowing that because of information technology, you can be linked all over the planet in social media mode or receiving news about things. But the actual process of education itself, the actual process of sharing information, the actual process of learning from and teaching, sharing with one another on a global scale, this process becomes effectuable as a result of an integrality approach to the delivery of education itself. What has since happened over these last several years since the initial recordings were done is that there has been an expansion. Additional pillars have come into the meta paradigm. And what are those pillars? One is education for creativity. I will elaborate on that in detail. One is education for consciousness. Again, another pillar. One is education for cosmology. This might seem a little foreign as a concept to people, but again, it will be elaborated upon. Education for transcendence. Very, very important to have that as a universal tool for everyone on the planet to understand how to transcend. Education for healing. This, unfortunately, has been one of the major, most egregious, intentional deficiencies of historical education systems. People do not know how to heal. They have been deprived of their right to heal through the disempowerment of the lack of knowledge of even their own bodies or how energy flows within their bodies. So education for healing must be, indeed, another integral pillar. The 13th pillar is education for evolution. We are in a continuously evolving society, a continuously evolving universe. This evolution need not be something to fear or to try to stifle, sabotage through conventional and through, you can call it ultra-reactionary rejectionism, traditionalism. What is necessary to prepare ourselves and to embrace in ourselves actually help facilitate an evolutional process of our global family. And finally, the 14th pillar is education for unity. And what is that about? What is unity on a global scale? What is unity within one's own sense of being? What is unity with our environment? What is unity with nature? What is unity with all the kingdoms and queendoms of this biosphere with which we share our home and our responsibilities for maintaining? So this has come forth as this second set of 7 pillars of integral education over the course of these last 3 years and a half since we had done those previous recordings. Global events that I've already identified certainly underscore an emergent platform of a fertile platform for these kinds of issues to come forth. And unfortunately, the intensification of so much of the contracted states of being, the lack of compassion that is demonstrated increasingly on the political and the social and the geopolitical scene, have brought back our awareness that there is indeed a global crisis of learning, a crisis of education, a crisis to solve the problems that we can no longer marginalize or defer and procrastinate about. It is no longer a matter of trying to improve the conditions of one group or one country. We are now indeed faced with the globality of things, and thus the greater urgency to advance these principles. I hope that this is a useful response to your question as an initial second phase introduction to the pillars of integral education. Thank you.